Up to this point, everything about AHA screamed chaos, mayhem, and insanity. So going into Plain Arcadia, I expected something along those lines, a chaotic, absurdist, random world of statistical improbabilities with an unexpected surprise waiting around every corner. But that is definitely not what we got. Plain Arcadia is weird, sure, but it certainly doesn't align with how I've perceived AHA and their path of elation up to this point. So I've found myself wondering if I've completely misunderstood what elation even is. Because I couldn't for the life of me understand why or how bringing one's artwork to life was supposed to be elating. And this power of elation that brings artwork to life, this wish power, is explicitly described as the power of belief and or attention. But how is that elation? Now, to be fair, this isn't the first time we've seen attention and belief linked to the elation. On Amphorius, for example, Cypher was the representative of elation within the simulation, and she had the power to turn lies into reality so long as people believed in them. And that's pretty similar to how AHA's planets have the ability to bring artworks to life so long as people believe in them hard enough. So I understand that the game is trying to push this idea that believing is elation, but what I didn't understand was why. And what started as a very simple investigation into a very simple question led to a very compelling twist that not only answered my question, but also revealed the truth behind what happened to Himiko and the Astral Express 15 years ago. So I suppose you could say I had my aha moment. And you too can have an aha moment once you find out how easy it is to top up your account with Eniba, the sponsor of today's video. Regular viewers will know that Eniba is my favorite place to get game keys, gift cards, and top up my game accounts because of how dedicated they are to safety and security. And yeah, I know every top-up shop wants to make sure your transactions are secure, that's just expected. But Eniba is the only top-up shop I know of that also ensures total compliance with a game's terms of service. And they don't add a game to their top-up service unless they're absolutely certain that that is the case. And that means that not only is your transaction completely secure, but the chances of your account getting deactivated because of a third-party transaction drops to nearly zero when you use Eniba. And fortunately for both you and me, topping up your account with Eniba is easy and convenient. All you have to do is go to the website, pick your game and desired currency package, then enter the server region and user ID of the account you want to top up on. Your purchase will be added to your account in a matter of minutes. And as an added bonus, you're going to earn cash back on every purchase, which makes future top-ups a whole lot cheaper than the alternatives. And since we've just arrived on Plain Arcadia, perhaps it is time you embrace the elation by inviting Sparksy to join the crew of the Astral Express. Or if you're more like me and you're very invested in solving this murder mystery we have on our hands, then what you need is a detective. And Detective Ashvale is coming out soon in just a couple of weeks, so stocking up now might be a smart move. But whatever your choice may be, if you are looking for a safe and convenient way to top up your account or send a gift to a friend, you can use the link in the description to check out what Eniba has to offer. A big thank you to Eniba for sponsoring this video, and now it is time for me to share the logic behind my aha moment. And in doing so, I will explain the philosophy of the elation. But to do that, we're gonna need some context. So let's start things off by going over the basic information that Plain Arcadia has given us. So out of all of the eons, AHA is said to be the one closest to humans. But what makes an eon more human than any other eon? I think the answer to that question is emotions, and I'll tell you why. Plain Arcadia follows a path of elation, and within its boundaries exists a special life form called the Imaginae. Now, Imaginae are literally works of art brought to life through a power of the elation called wish power, and this process is called imagenesis. We'll talk more in depth about these two things later, but generally speaking, the purpose of art is to convey an idea or emotion of the artist that made it. And it's the fact that art can embody such intangible concepts that gives it a sense of soul, or to use a common expression, makes it feel alive. So the way I see it, art is intrinsically tied to emotions, and if elation is tied to art, then elation and emotion must also be connected. Pretty simple math, right? But I think we can also take this a step further and say that the path of elation is a path that governs emotions. Because if you think about it, every eon aside from AHA exhibits a very limited emotional range, perhaps due to the boundaries of their paths that they're bound to. Now, assuming AHA has the same restrictions as the other eons in the fact that they are bound very tightly to their path, then for AHA to be the eon closest to humanity, it would make sense if the path they're bound to is a path that governs the thing that makes humans the most human they can be. hence an emotional path. And I don't think it's a coincidence that their path name is named after an emotion. Now, I'll concede that aha seems to be linked only to one emotion on the surface, but I don't think that's actually the case. While aha seems to favor the emotion of joy more than any other, I would argue that aha actually delights in the existence of the emotional roller coaster that is life itself, so both the ups and the downs. Like this loading screen says, aha inspires their believers to delight in the joys of life, but they also take pleasure in sharp turns of fate. And sharp turns of fate aren't always things to be happy about. And to look at this from another perspective, you could say that the path of elation is supposed to represent elevated emotional states. Heck, we could even assume that their chaotic nature is just a manifestation of their extreme emotional impulses. Now that said, in plain Arcadia, the power of elation manifests as wish power, which relies on belief. And I wouldn't necessarily classify belief as a feeling. However, beliefs and feelings do share a causal link. In psychology, we call this link psychic equivalence. So psychic equivalence describes a state wherein a person believes that everything within their mind is real. So let's say, for example, that you feel something, and you justify the way you feel by believing that there is something real out there causing you to feel that way. So if you feel fear, you might believe that there is something out there to be afraid of. It doesn't matter if there actually is, you feel that way, so you believe it to be true. Feeling is believing. So I think that when aha is involved, psychic equivalency becomes a real phenomenon. Your feelings create beliefs which generate wish power. And that wish power takes the things in your imagination, in your mind, and manifests them in the real world. And it just so happens that in plain Arcadia, you can control this process through art. You take a feeling which is connected to your imagination, and then you believe it to be true, which generates wish power, which can bring your artwork to life. This is why the manifested creations are called imaginae, and the creation process is called imagenesis, creation from the imagination. Imagination genesis. And I'm gonna argue that the entirety of plain Arcadia is centered around this idea of psychic equivalency. And I think we saw it for the first time with Pearl and her struggle with understanding the concept of artistry. And art, as I said earlier, is a product of emotion. But Pearl is an intellitron, an inorganic mechanical life form, and inorganic life forms excel at logic and reason operations, not feelings. So while she is incredibly skilled at analyzing art and recreating it stroke for stroke, she struggles with the emotional aspect of the creative process. And in plain Arcadia, if feeling is believing, and believing is needed for manifestation via wish power, then until Pearl can embrace irrationality and allow herself to experience psychic equivalency by abandoning her sense of logic and reason and believing in things that don't exist, she will continue to struggle with the concept of artistry and, by proxy, imagenesis. Now, we're only one section into this video and we've already answered the question we set out to answer. And yet, there's still quite a lot of video to go. So you know what that means? That's right! It's time for a plot twist! Because psychic equivalency isn't just limited to all of this imagenesis stuff and manifesting things from your imagination. It's also linked to the concept of identity, which brings me to plain Arcadia's secondary theme of masking. A theatrical mask symbolizes both the expressions, which indicate emotions, and the identity of the character or person they belong to. When an actor dons a mask, they become that character. They feel what that character feels, and they try to convince the audience that they are that character. They are manifesting something from their imagination and making the unreal real through identity theft. And aha embodies this concept as well because it's also a form of psychic equivalency. And once you start looking for it, you're gonna notice that the theme of identity is everywhere in plain Arcadia. Yes, you can obviously see it in the use of masks like the one in the Phantasmoon games, but it's also a big part of the imaginae. Because when the imaginae manifest, they have to first establish their own identities. And sometimes that identity is called into question. Like a lot of the readables in plain Arcadia are actually like legal documents that detail the process of how imaginae claim their legal identities. Some books go into great depth on things like what are imaginae made of, calling into question whether or not the physical makeup of an imaginae can be used to identify them, and no, apparently it can't, because at their core, they're all just wish power, which you can't use to differentiate one life form from another the way you can with something like DNA. So an imaginae's identity is not necessarily tied to their physical makeup, but more on who who they believe themselves to be. If they believe themselves to be a Furbo, then they are a Furbo, because that's what feels right to them. And that's why I'm calling this psychic equivalency. And the idea that your identity is based in your beliefs is especially clear when it comes to ghosts. Because in plain Arcadia, ghosts are legally disconnected from the person they were when they were alive, because they're dead. But the ghosts believe themselves to be the same person that they were when they were alive, even though that is not legally the case. They are the ghost of that person, but they are not that person. And if that's not enough to give someone an identity crisis, I don't know what is. And then we have doppelganger situations like with Sparksy and Sparkle. Sparksy appears to be one of Sparkle's many VTuber models who went through imagenesis and took on a life of her own, only to attempt identity theft by declaring herself to be the real Sparkle. Although in the end, it does appear that the two of them had a mutual understanding that they were both two masks that the true Sparkle wears, which means they're not competing for an identity, they're sharing one. And the more I think about it, the more I think that this conflict between Sparkle and Sparksy is kind of foreshadowing for some of Plain Arcadia's other important plot points. For example, the Herald of Death was allegedly executed after his murder spree at the Phantasmoon Games 15 years ago, and now we have what appears to be a copycat killer, or rather, someone who's borrowing the serial killer's identity. But alternatively, we could have someone who created a new Herald of Death through imagenesis. And before I get to the other really big plot point that I think is being foreshadowed here, I need you to understand that this psychic equivalency thing is not limited to just individual life forms. I think it actually applies to the entire planet. Now, I need to go on a bit of a weird detour to explain this one, and you need to understand why the entire planet is technically a manifestation of psychic equivalency. So bear with me for a second. So Plain Arcadia has a surprising amount of references to Pure Land Buddhism, of all things. I have never once associated Buddhism with AHA, but here we are. So the Pure Land branch of Buddhism is all about being reborn within the pure lands of a Buddha. And if you manage to do that, then you can train to become a Buddha yourself, and in doing so, you will gain the ability to shape reality. And this implies the existence of two very important realms, the realm of truth and the realm of falsehoods, aka the Pure Land and reality. In this context, AHA would be a Buddha, while Plain Arcadia is their Pure Land, and the Phantasmoon Games are like the trial that one has to undergo in order to become the Buddha. Participants in these games are called supplicants, which are people who offer up prayers to a deity as proof of their belief in that power. And only the supplicant who generated the most wish power, which is based in belief, can achieve Buddhahood for 1 minute. And in Chinese, wish power is actually literally named after Pure Land Buddhism's other power, and other power is tied to the ability to shape reality in the same way wish power is used for imagenesis, which means that AHA's true power is to perform acts of imagenesis on a universal scale. So like instant alterations to reality based on one's imagination. And those instant alterations are permanent, which is kind of an important thing to keep in mind because the Imaginae are not permanent. They can only exist under the light of the Phantasmoon. If they get too far away from it, they just vanish. Now, the reason I'm pointing all of this out is because I've seen a lot of speculation surrounding some of the inconsistencies within the history and current events in Plain Arcadia and how they might be the result of time travel or some other time-based shenanigans. But in my view, there's nothing about AHA's ability or references that are related to time, but they are related to causality, specifically the causal link that exists between the imaginary and the real. And we call that causal link, say it with me now, psychic equivalency. Which is why I think that rather than there being multiple timelines on Plain Arcadia or some sort of backwards and forwards time travel going on, there are instead two Plain Arcadias, one imaginary version and one real version. Now don't worry, I haven't forgotten about that second plot point explanation I promised you. It's just that it also requires a little bit of a history lesson. Because it's only through history that we can understand how it's possible for Plain Arcadia to have two separate forms. So a long time ago, the Antimatter Legion launched an attack against a Consternation star system, obliterating several planets and putting many more in the star system at risk. Under extreme duress, the legendary painter Graphia managed to find a way to control the Elation aberration phenomenon in a process she called imagenesis. This gave people the ability to create stable imaginae, which were then used to fight against the Legion. But when that wasn't enough to drive the Legion back, she sought help from AHA and ended up becoming a supplicant in what appears to be the first Phantasmoon Phantasmoon game. She won and used her 1 minute of Buddhahood to perform imagenesis on the entire planet, which turned it into a two-dimensional painting known today as the world on canvas. Years later, this two-dimensional world was reconstructed into a 3D world with outside help from the IPC and Punklordian Ether editors. But the 2D world on canvas didn't just disappear when the 3D world came into being. In fact, you can still enter the 2D world either intentionally or accidentally. In fact, we did it in the main quest a couple of times. Remember when Evanescia pulled us through a portal in a sheet of paper into the Phantasmoon courtyard? Well, the courtyard exists within the world on canvas. And I'm mentioning this event specifically because Evanescia has all of the hallmarks of being one of Fuli's fragments, a pure child of Anasrava, which is also a part of Pure Land Buddhism. And I think that, just like Cyrene, her role here might be linked to anchoring Plane Arcadia's causality. But I don't think she's anchoring time so much as space, for lack of a better term. Because the way I see it, if the 3D world came from the 2D world, then Plane Arcadia behaves similarly to Imagine, because those are 2D characters that are becoming 3D life forms. And in that respect, we could think of the 2D world on canvas as the cause to the 3D world's effect. This would imply the existence of a causal relationship between the two, and in fact, it could even go both ways. If the 2D world can impact the 3D world, then the reverse may also be true. This mirrors Fuli's themes of retrocausality, but with space instead of time. So if you were to paint something onto the world on canvas, it would find a way to manifest in the 3D world through imagenesis or something similar to it. And things that happen in the 3D world may have some sort of 2D counterpart on the canvas. So if you paint a 2D apple on the 2D world, it will appear in the 3D space. But if you grow an apple in the 3D space, it might appear on the 2D canvas. And this too is psychic equivalency. Now, this hypothesis of a causal link between two different Plane Arcadias can easily explain nearly every phenomenon or inconsistency within Plane Arcadia, including the things that look like space-time anomalies, like that recreation of the Herald of Death's classroom crime scene. That is not a space-time anomaly. Someone painted that moment and manifested it using imagenesis. And this causal relationship can also explain why Yao Guang's temporal displacement got worse when she arrived on Plane Arcadia. If someone were to mess with the world on canvas secretly, it could disrupt that causal link between 2D and 3D. That would generate more variables for fate to calculate, and in fact, there could be an infinite number of variables, which is why Elio's script is blank. There is no set future here. Now, quick disclaimer, I am not sure if this 2D and 3D world thing is the same as Plane Arcadia's Glee and Gloom state. I'm leaning towards no, but truthfully, I'm not sure yet. But what I am pretty sure of is that this causal relationship between the 2D and 3D has something to do with the weirdness around Himiko and the crash landing of the Astral Express on Plane Arcadia. And yes, this is the plot point I was talking about. See, Himiko has told us two very different contradictory stories about how she found and repaired the Astral Express before she became its navigator 15 years ago. In one account, she says that she saw the Astral Express falling out of the sky while hiking at night in a remote location for stargazing alone on her birthday, and it nearly smushed her. She then immediately entered the Express and proceeded to repair it like she was possessed. But in another account, Himiko says that the Astral Express actually crash-landed on Plane Arcadia long before she was born, and it had long since been abandoned before she found it when she was young. And then she spent years trying to repair it. Given that the Express was repaired and departed Plane Arcadia 15 years ago, Himiko would have had to be extremely young when she found it, like 11 or 12 years old. Because I think she's only around like 30-ish right now. And I was having a hard time trying to reconcile these two different accounts of what happened, even when factoring in for stuff like time travel. And then I found this one tiny detail that was hidden in a databank entry for Plane Arcadia, and suddenly all of the pieces clicked into place. Because this databank entry says that the Astral Express entered the painting along with the world when it crash-landed. In other words, the Astral Express crash-landed in two places at the same time, once in the 3D world and once in the 2D world. And if the Express can crash-land twice in one period of time, then it could be repaired in two separate instances. In one instance, it could have taken a long time to repair. And if there's a causal link between these two worlds, then there's also a causal link between the two crashes and the two instances of repair. which means that there's also probably a link between the two people who repaired it. And if both of those people are Himiko, then one Himiko could have spent a long time repairing the Express, while the other would have instantly known how to repair it and would have gone on to repair it instantly as if she were possessed. And the idea that there are two Himikos with a causal link between each other could also explain this awkward encounter between Himiko and her father near the end of the quest. Her father, Ryusuke, claims that Himiko died in the Herald of Death's massacre, while Himiko separately claims that she had been fighting for her life while her father was absent. And he was absent like all the time. Now do keep in mind that it's been 15 years since they've seen each other, so it would make sense that Ryusuke didn't recognize his daughter, regardless of any sort of time or causality shenanigans going on. Because I don't know about you, but I don't really look exactly the way I did when I was 15. And if Ryusuke was absent a lot of the time, Himiko likely had very few memories of her father to draw from anyway. So I don't think it's that weird that she doesn't recognize him. That said, I don't think Ryusuke is lying. I do think that one of the Himikos is dead. I'm just not sure which one. But if I had to guess, I'd say it was the 3D one. Cause see, when Himiko finally boarded the Express, she first signed her name as Mura. The rest of the name isn't legible because it's a signature, but it's likely short for Murata, the surname of Himiko Murata from Honkai Impact 3rd, which is who Himiko is supposed to be referencing here. Now my guess is that the 3D Himiko actually used the name Murata as a nickname, or like a street or biker name, because she used to get in brawls all the time when she was younger. So I think that was kind of like her preferred mask or identity. And viewed through this light, she kind of fits that whole trope of Japanese high school delinquents. And I think that this version of Himiko is the one that died fighting against the Herald of Death. And it was the 2D Himiko who assumed her identity, and who also in the end decided not to use the name Murata going forward and decided to just go by the name Himiko in honor of the other one's death. Now the reason I say this has everything to do with Himiko's clothing, because I've always thought that Himiko's clothing and accessories were very Grecian. I even thought she might be connected to Amphorius because of it in the past, but now I have a bit of a different thought. We're currently in Planet Arcadia, her homeland. This is the land where art comes to life. And one of the most iconic Grecian myths about art coming to life is the myth of Galatea, a statue Pygmalion carved into his image of the perfect woman who was then brought to life. It's very Imagenesis coded. But while her dress and accessories are very Grecian at their core, the jacket or overcoat she wears doesn't really vibe with the Grecian theme. But I'll be damned if it doesn't look just like a long gakuran. Gakurans are commonly worn in Japan as like high school uniform blazers, but they're also really iconic when it comes to delinquents or punks or street fighters and that kind of thing, especially with the way she wears it kind of off one shoulder. And seeing how Himiko describes herself, the 3D version as I'm dubbing it, as a sort of high school delinquent that fights on the street, I think it would be really cool if this 2D Galatea-esque Himiko is continuing to wear that jacket in memory of the version of her who died. Or maybe I'm just looking for patterns where there are none and she just likes it. Now, in the spirit of fairness, I'm going to play devil's advocate against myself, because on the one hand, we could argue that this discrepancy between these two accounts that Himiko gives on finding the Express could just boil down to Hoyo retconning itself in order to have Himiko better fit with Plain Arcadia as her homeworld. So a narrative choice. But I don't like this because it doesn't suit my narrative, so I'm going to ignore it for now. And the second thing I need to bring up is the idea that the 2D Himiko would probably have to be some sort of imagine, right? And Himiko being an imagine is kind of problematic because imagine cannot leave Planet Arcadia because there's not enough wish power out in the greater world without the Phantasmoon and Aha's Elation presence for them to maintain their forms. And so because the 2D Himiko would have been flying all over the universe and she's not disappearing, she can't really be the standard sort of imagine. However, I do want to acknowledge the fact that Sparkle exists. And we never really got confirmation that Sparkle is like the original. She just gets called an old model by Sparksy over and over again. So we have to consider the possibility that Sparkle might actually have been at one point an imagine, but she assumed the identity of the original Sparkle and became more human in that way? Making some bold leaps here because it's also possible that Sparkle is just the original, but I feel like I have to mention that the Imaginae also get called Fae or Strangelings, both of which are mythical creatures who are known for creating doppelgangers that replace humans, as well as stealing the identities of humans themselves by taking their names. So an Imaginae successfully taking the place of a real person isn't too far-fetched of an idea. And if an Imaginae does successfully take the place of a real person, they would no longer rely on the power of belief, which is wish power. So in theory, that should allow them to safely leave Plane Arcadia without vanishing, right? And maybe that's what happened with Sparkle. Heck, maybe it keeps happening with Sparkle. Maybe the original has been replaced so many times that we don't know who the original Sparkle even was. And if that's the case, then there is no problem with Himiko actually being an Imaginae at one point in time because she would have assumed the identity of the real Himiko, the 3D one, so she would therefore be the real Himiko. And she could easily sustain her form without wish power because she's real. There's a lot of unknowns and what-ifs here, I know that. But we're still really early on and I'm working with what I got. And look, I doubt what I've laid out today is exactly how things are or how they'll go down. But I've at least done what I set out to do. I answered the question I had at the beginning and discovered some really fun things along the way. And while I'm here, I have to take a moment to thank my lore buddy Kat for suggesting that Himiko might be an Imaginae, because that's what sent me down this whole rabbit hole in the first place. Not necessarily the question. The question kind of came from the fact of like, well, wait, what is an Imaginae? What is wish power and that kind of stuff? So like, in the end, I kind of ended up writing this whole thing backwards. We're no longer on Amphorius, but somehow I still can't escape retrocausality. Anywho, let me know your thoughts on the powers of Elation, the oddities of Plane Arcadia, and what you think is up with Himiko. Wrong answers only, please. And let me send out a big thanks to all of my channel members for making these speculative investigations possible, and another thanks to all of you for watching them. Please take care of yourselves out there, and remember, AHA loves you. Mwah! Bye-bye!